here. So let's talk about what you're doing as one of the leaders in the movement for affordable housing, specifically in Cambridge, and then we'll get into the implications for the greater metro area.
Right. So the interesting thing to think about is what would be possible solutions to the current crisis. And if you focus mainly on the needs of the lowest income people as a starting point, saying that whatever we do, we have to meet their needs. And we also want to address the needs of the young technocrats who are underhoused. But let's focus on those in greatest need, those who face evictions because they're behind in the rent, those who face instability because they own a home, but they're constantly paying off the mortgage and they never quite do it. So it's like they're paying rent to a bank and they're in jeopardy of losing the homes that they supposedly own, but really it's the bank that still owns them. If you're going to meet those needs, there are protections that are needed right away. And those include protection against evictions that are based only on the inability to pay rent. There also is a need for rent control so people aren't squeezed out by the ability of landlords to raise rents as they wish. Rent control is banned in all of Massachusetts, and there is a movement to reverse that and allow cities to make the choice. We'll talk about that because the mayor of Boston is a leader in that effort. But other cities would like to be able to have rent control. Then there is the need to actually construct housing. And the best estimates, and the current lieutenant governor has um, uh, said that she believes that this is a correct estimate. The current estimate is that 200,000 new units would be needed to meet the current housing crisis. That's a lot of units.
Is that just for Boston or for all of the state, the whole
All of the
state?
state. The biggest need is Greater Boston, so that's not surprising. Um, but the current rate at which the market-based builders are working, we're never going to hit that 200,000. And so the question is, what would be a way of getting large-scale new building? And if you're not going to be able to count on the market base, that is the profit driven builders to do it, you have to find something else. And decades ago, people thought, well, the federal government, the state government would build big housing projects. And that was the effort to solve the housing crisis of 20, 30 years ago. That's gone. There are no monies for that. And what's more, we also know that those projects turn out not to be the boon that people hoped they would be. And part of the reason for that is the fact that they were housing ghettos, just large scale buildings with very poor people in them. And those were hard to maintain. They took the governments that owned them would try to police them. That made the living conditions for the people who were in these housing projects even more onerous. So while there certainly are successful projects, and there are several here in Cambridge, they are not the solution for the current period. What strikes me as a new and exciting idea in this country is something called social housing. And there are a few instances of social housing in this country, one near you, Hal, as you probably know, but they are very well known in Europe. And the reason for that is that social housing was brought to the fore by organizers in Austria, in Vienna in particular, in the 1920s. And they were enormously successful in the social housing movement. And we should talk about what it actually is.
So I
But
wanted you
just
to get into that in just a sec. Just want to jump in real quick because I put up this other slide just because I wanted to point out or have folks see the domino effect as the housing prices rise in one community, such as Cambridge and obviously the city of Boston, other cities that also in the past serve working class communities of color have likewise become more and more unaffordable, and thus push people further and further out, or displace them, or even cause some homelessness. So it's obviously it's a community wide, it's a city metro area, really ultimately statewide problem, because you have folks moving from Boston, if you know the area, 35 miles out or more to Worcester, et cetera. And then you get real pockets of poverty, very deep poverty as well, generally far from any job centers. And I'm thinking places like New Bedford, Fall River, although that may be gentrifying, right? Isn't Fall River getting a little more, I guess, becoming a job center to a degree, Henry?
to a degree. But the effect on commuting that you've just described is widespread, certainly here in Greater Boston, but it's also a major problem in Western Mass, where people drive long distances in order to get from home to job. And I recently learned that it's a problem around the country. So in uh, eastern Idaho, western Montana, it's an enormous problem because people are driving 2 hours and more in each direction in order to be able to go from their affordable homes to the jobs that they've had for years. So
I
this
can
is a
believe that.
country.
When we were in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a little over a year ago, Henry, the houses there are, they're all multi-million dollar homes. So if you want to, if you work in a restaurant at a relatively, minimum wage or slightly above that, it's not like you can just go 20 minutes outside of town, because that's where there's going to be ski condos and everything gets pushed up. Everything, just as we're seeing here. So how can social housing, to tie this together, how can social housing address the exact phenomenon you're describing?
Right, right. So I'll tell you what social housing has been in Vienna, where 80% of the city's population, this is a major city, 80% live in what is termed social housing. And it's relevant here in Massachusetts because this year a bill was introduced that would provide for the first pilot construction of social housing in this state. So, what is social housing? Social housing is rental housing that's constructed classically on land that is government owned. The construction is either underwritten by a government entity or a government entity in partnership with a non-government entity, typically an NGO. The proposal in Massachusetts would fund the pilot projects in social housing by a bond issue of, and the current proposal is for about $100 million. The new buildings would have multiple units and they would be rented not simply to low income people, but one third roughly would be for low income. One third would be for people who make median income, and one third would be for people who make incomes of greater than median. What would happen is these tenants would be charged in according to their ability to pay. So the low income tenants would have their rent subsidized by the state. The median income tenants would pay the real cost of the units that they occupy. And the high income tenants would pay more than the maintenance of their units would cost. The result would be that year after year, the entire building would generate more income than the original cost for the loans and construction would have cost. And that means that new money would be generated for further construction.
Now, one
Having
of
buildings, yes, go on.
no, I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is really important stuff, but one of the concerns I've heard, or certainly in New York City, where they build these apartments privately built, is that yes, there might be some apartments in a structure that are for lower income tenants or residents, but they're separate entrances. They're clearly inferior. There even could be a stigma because you're going in through the, non-door person side of the building. There's no overlap. In other words, you can't get from the lower or middle class apartments to the upper middle class or affluent apartments. So is that the case with this type of housing that you're describing?
Just the opposite. So what you're describing is well known to people who are interested in the housing movement. That typically is the type of quote solution that's imposed on what's known as inclusionary housing, where for-profit developers have to promise that they will have a few percent of low-income units included within their high-cost buildings. And since the profiteering developers are really interested in the needs of their high-income occupants, they are perfectly happy to make small ghettos in these high-income buildings. Social housing does the opposite. The idea is to make these units seamlessly livable for the low, median, and high income tenants so that no one is ghettoized. And what's more, the control of the properties rests with tenant associations with input from neighborhood stakeholders so that there is no police governance of the low income tenants, which is unfortunately something that happens with the classic housing projects. These don't work that way. And from what we know about Vienna, Sweden, Mexico, Israel, many places where social housing has been introduced, the ability of people from diverse incomes to live together has been one of the most interesting, positive outcomes of the social housing experience.
Is this viable politically in this country?
Well, that's a question I could well ask you because you're near to one of the few projects in this country. Um, and I can't give you the answer for Massachusetts yet because this is a new initiative. But what I can say is that where it's been introduced to people who are interested in the housing problem, the housing challenge, it gets more exuberant, spontaneous support than any other proposal I've heard in years. It absolutely gets people excited. And much more so than, for instance, rent control, which is really contentious. As important as it may be, people say, "Well, what about my parents who rent out one unit? This is going to affect them." Or they say rent control will impede the construction of new housing. Without going into uh, the correctness of those arguments, I just want to say that rent control is highly contentious. Social housing, while it well may attract the opposition of for profit developers, to date has not done that. And instead, people who learn about it are really enthusiastic.
Well, I put up this quick shot here from NPR's report of a few years ago, and you mentioned that there is a development, a social housing program in DC here, and right outside of DC in Montgomery County, my county. The political question is really interesting. You need to have a really progressive government, right? And we have that in Montgomery County, or at least we have a leader. Our county executive, Mark Elrich, he's not mentioned here, is very, very progressive. Vaughn Stewart, very, very progressive. And I guess as long as the landlords themselves aren't directly impacted, they're not going to fight so aggressively against it, since the apartments are owned by the government itself. Now, they don't like, though, of course, competition. Developers don't want competition. So you asked me my thoughts. I think, like so much in our country, we need to have some kind of sea change that is led both by the public, by activists like yourself, as well as some, do-gooder type politicians who really actually care about their constituents. And we haven't seen a lot of that, but I guess we see some of it. Maybe then when if they work to the point where it's just obvious that this is better, we'll have a real groundswell for social housing.
Right. And I mentioned earlier that the current mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu, is known to be a progressive and supports rent control and other housing initiatives. Um, but the governor of the state, Maura Healey, who took office just under a year ago, is not known as a progressive on fiscal issues. In fact, she's quite conservative. Nevertheless, there is good reason to think that she might be supportive of a pilot program in social housing. And the reason for it is that there are no other obvious solutions, and the need is enormous. And so, and I'm guessing here, but for somebody like Governor Healy, a knockdown fight around rent control isn't going to be helpful. But social housing if it becomes established, begins to relieve some of the pressure because it means construction of a significant number of those needed 200,000 units. And it's not as if the private sphere developers are itching to build 200,000 units of essentially low income housing. They just don't get the profit out of that that would justify their doing that level of construction.
All right, you're watching Halitics, by the way. I'm Hal Ginsberg. We do have Henry Wortis. He's a affordable housing advocate among many hats he wears. We're so glad to have Henry joining us. If you want, I certainly ask you to click like and click subscribe. The square at the bottom right of your screen. If you haven't already done so, click subscribe to Halitics. And we have Henry for another 15 minutes or so. He is a busy gentleman, has other work he has to do. So we appreciate him generously giving of his time. Henry, one of my biggest peeves, biggest complaints, biggest criticisms of our country right now is the massive wealth and income inequality. And to me, this really kind of taints everything we try to do. It makes it more challenging. We talk about Vienna, Austria, where this has reached its apotheosis, social housing, that is. That's a much more equal society. The wealth and income inequality is a fraction of what we have. Does that militate against social housing being as successful here?
Well, we don't have the answer to that. I can understand why that would be a concern, Hal, but there aren't as yet enough examples of social housing in this country to be able to say that they work uniformly or they work given the right circumstances or that they don't work at all. I don't know whether, given the proximity to the relatively new development in Maryland, if you've had the chance to get a sense of how people like living in that development or living close to it, or to get a sense of how it's impacted those who live in nearby units.
So one of the other issues, and no, I haven't, you mentioned I guess I need to do my homework here. So I thank you, Professor. Henry is a professor indeed. So I thank you for giving me an assignment. I feel like I'm back at school and not real happy about it, but I'll have to follow up. I've mentioned race and racism. So are there plans? Is there a conscious effort is social housing I'm sorry to struggle with the question, part of a conscious effort to redress racism, the impacts of racism, and the specific challenges facing Black and brown people?
So I wouldn't hazard a guess as to what motivates individual advocates. I do know that the major tenant organizing groups, which exist, not surprisingly, in Boston, in Worcester, in Springfield, in Lynn, these are all in descending orders, large cities in Massachusetts. Those tenant-based movements largely mobilize people of color. And the reason for this, and this is not going to be a surprise to you, Hal, is because low income and poverty in this country tracks with race, and that's been reinforced by housing policies, which for decades have created disparities in home ownership. You may have gone into this in the past, but it was absolutely true that when we had federal housing projects created around the time of World War II and shortly thereafter, they excluded African Americans, Black Americans, and and this was federal policy. And then, of course, zoning has excluded people of color in many communities. So it's not surprising then that housing movements that mobilize people in need have to focus on people of color, have to be led by people of color. So you don't have to be consciously anti-racist in order to advocate for better housing, but that's what you're going to be focused on because that's where the need is most acute.
Well, let me ask it this way more directly then. Is for the social housing, just as you mentioned, there would be three tiers of income level, right? So below at poverty or close to poverty, who pay significantly below market rates, middle class people who would pay the market rate, and maybe some more affluent people who would pay above market because these are attractive apartments, and even above market for those apartments might be cheaper than what you would pay in a privately owned apartment. So you'd still be getting a relatively good deal. Is there also, though, an effort or emphasis on diversity in terms of race? So you would have a percentage. I mean, I don't know how, the way even colleges and universities have done and gotten a lot of flack for it, but wanting to have a relatively, equal in terms of the percentage of the population at their matriculating at their school. So maybe 10% African American and 5% Latino and 10% Asian or whatever. I'm just picking numbers out of the air. Is that part of this as well, or is the focus solely on income diversity?
So there is a bill that's before the current state legislature. It does not have any aspect of affirmative action written into it. It is strictly a bond-based bill that says money would be raised and land purchased and housing built that would have these attributes of social housing. And it doesn't address specifically or implicitly issues of race and ethnicity.
Is it your sense that will still, even without explicitly stating we're going to set aside a certain number of units for people of color, for African Americans, is it your sense that this nevertheless will provide a disproportionate benefit? And what do other advocates say? A disproportionate benefit to African Americans in the Boston area?
So let me come at that with two specific answers. So we have a Greater Boston transportation system, and I take the bus and the subway to work, and I know because I count this because it's so striking. When I get on the bus at the corner each morning, about 80% of the riders are people of color. That's perhaps 4 times higher than the population of people of color in the city of Cambridge. Now, it isn't as if our public transport system was designed to meet the needs of people of color, but the financial disparities, who owns a car, who does not, means that the bulk of people who use public transport are people of color. So I think if social housing becomes available in the way I've talked about it, there will be a, if not a preponderance, a higher fraction of low-income people who are people of color who occupy these units. So that's a prediction. There is another aspect of the housing crisis that social housing does not meet, and that is African Americans who have been excluded from the housing market for generations say, well, you all, as white people, have been able to purchase homes uh, just the way you, Henry, you purchased a home and its value has gone up. You have now command of an enormous amount of wealth in that you own a part of a three-decker building here in Cambridge. I've never had that opportunity, an African American might say. So you're telling me, Henry, get into social housing. Well, that's going to be a rental unit. That's not going to be a home that I own, a home that would allow me and my family over generations to accumulate equity. So, yes, you're meeting my needs for housing, but you're not allowing me to accumulate wealth in the way you've been able to. I think that's a real need. I think that's a real challenge. I don't have a good answer for it. And I think that while I'm a strong advocate of social housing because it has the potential to meet the need of many, many people, it does not meet the needs of those people, and it may be a small minority of those people who feel that the need for equity is a major need that has to be met. And I don't have a simple answer for that, but I
Yeah, that's
don't
a really
pretend.
powerful story. You've told me that before, Henry, and I was, I'm sort of a knee jerk opponent of race targeted, race specific remedies. I think that evidence has shown that they cause a lot of tension and rancor between groups that I want to see allied together, that being working class, whites, Latinos, and African Americans. But there's no gainsaying that point, right? I mean, I have benefited, you have benefited from our ability and our family's ability to purchase homes that were denied other, people of color, our brothers and sisters who are black and often Latino were denied. Now, we could make the argument, well, we're Jews and Jews were kept out of certain neighborhoods by covenants. It's true, but the fact remains that we're doing well. I mean, I feel like I am. I don't want to speak for you, but um, the hurdles that we faced, we were able to overcome. The hurdles that many African Americans face, they weren't. And there's an interesting story out of San Francisco. Just tell real quick how, and this was certainly true in New York. Robert Moses, the power broker in New York, they built highways right through often African American communities, displacing people, displacing homeowners. A black middle class was destroyed in parts of San Francisco, certainly in New York, and so those effects are within have those occurred within maybe the lifetimes of some people, even today, unlike slavery. So we do have to keep this in mind, bear this in mind, and I don't have a good answer either. Maybe just much higher taxes on the wealthy, but even that wouldn't really, unless we're prepared to just move to a truly level society, which I think would also cause problems. We have to reckon with this. We have to deal with it. You're right.
Right. And not a simple solution. Yeah.
So Henry, you mentioned we've got just a couple more minutes. I told Henry he'd be off at 12:53 Eastern, so it's 12:51. Are you seeing improvement? I mean, you and I have never been any blue will do type Democrats. You now have a Democratic governor, Maura Healey. You mentioned she's somewhat of a neo-liberal, much like perhaps your former Governor Charlie Baker and before him Mitt Romney. Is Maura Healey like a major breath of fresh air compared to those Republicans?
Well, if you listen to the neoliberals and the leadership of the Democratic Party, she's all of that and more. I don't think the evidence for that is there. She is a champion a champion of reproductive rights and has found ways to be innovative in making certain that Massachusetts will be able to provide reproductive rights not only to its residents, but to people from states that are restrictive who find that they have to come to Massachusetts. She's been great in all of that. She's also been a champion for LGBTQ and trans, um, and she is the first openly lesbian candidate who won and is now our governor. And she has championed that. So all of that is great. But on fiscal policies, she's taken the lead of conservatives, and I don't want to spend much of this
Yeah,
program
that's
in bashing
for
her.
another time. But it is very, very problematic. Henry, thank you so much. It's great to see you. Great to talk to you. You brought a lot of important information and discussion to the table. So thanks, and let's talk again soon.
Hal, thanks for providing this opportunity. It's great to see you doing this, and I love the fact that you're doing what you love and are bringing a message of hope to so many people. So good luck with that.
All right, and I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks so much, Henry Wortis, and thanks for watching and listening.